So what is Bayer up to at the moment?
The main thing they're trying to do is to get Congress and the states to indemnify them against lawsuits. They want complete legal protection. So we wrote a brief to the Supreme Court in which we argued, if you indemnify this company, you're actually rewarding them for fraud.
You're listening to EU Watchdog Radio.
Hi, I'm Joanna, Comms Officer at Corporate Europe Observatory, or CEO. I know it's still summer, and behind me you can probably hear the sea, but this episode just could not wait. Today, my amazing colleague Nina Holland will speak to the equally amazing Naomi Oreskes. Naomi Oreskes is an historian of science, professor at Harvard University. She's the author or co-author of 8 books, over 150 articles and essays. She's the co-author with Eric M. Conway of the best-selling books Merchants of Doubt and The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. Merchants of Doubt identified parallels between the climate change debate and earlier different public controversies, notably the tobacco industry's lobbying and propaganda campaign to obscure the link between smoking and lung cancer. Nina Holland works with me at CEO, and she's a campaigner and researcher, and right now she's focusing on agribusiness, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and lobbying in the EU. So, as you can imagine, there is a lot that they do have in common, and they talk about Naomi's recent work and Merchants of Doubt and The Big Myth and the strategies, tactics and terms used by big business to stay in business, no matter what the costs are. They talk about glyphosate, many other topics, and also what we can do about it as society, but also as academics, scientists, business owners and decision makers. But before I give them the floor, I'd like to remind you of 2 very little things. The first one is that this podcast is done with Counterbalance, and we publish on the last Thursday of the month. In September, you'll get a great new episode on public investment in data centers and AI. Make sure you follow us wherever you get your podcasts. The second reminder is that CEO is a very small and independent organization. So if you can and if you want to make a donation to help us continue to do our work, visit our website at www.corporateeurope.org/support-CEO. We do appreciate any donation, no matter how small or big. Over to Nina and Naomi.
So Naomi, you are a professor in the history of science and you have authored a number of books, and I want to name 2, Merchants of Doubt and The Big Myth. The latter one is from 2023. So for a broad audience, Merchants of Doubt, who are these merchants and what are their key tactics?
The Merchants of Doubt are people who cast doubt on science. And what we showed in the book was that, well, we became interested in the people who were casting doubt on climate science. Who were they and why were they doing it? And what we discovered was that they were sort of professional merchants of doubt, that they had cast doubt on science and a whole set of different issues related to environment and public health, including acid rain, the ozone hole, the harms of the pesticide DDT. And so when we looked into the why are they doing this? You might have thought it was obvious they were just industry shills, but that turned out not to be the case. It was much more ideologically driven. It was connected to an argument about regulation being a slippery slope to socialism, an argument that came out of the Cold War and was linked to neoliberal theories about free markets protecting political freedom. And so this is what really drove the original Merchants of Doubt. But what we also showed in the book was that in a very short period of time, they made common cause with the fossil fuel industry and other regulated industries, and a network of think tanks, mostly in the United States, but also in Europe and Australia, to promote free market ideology as a means to prevent or roll back regulation.
Right, and this is what we're seeing now in Europe as well, is that there's a whole deregulation wave. Regulations that are meant to protect are being attacked. So in the big myth, what is the big myth, and is it the corporations also that are spreading it?
Yes, so the big myth is the myth of the magic of the marketplace, the myth that the free market will generate the goods and services we need with no harm to anyone, and we don't need regulation. We should just trust the magic of the marketplace, trust the invisible hand, and that regulations just get in the way of prosperity. So that's the myth. And what we show in the new book is how that myth, which is widely believed by many people, and it's part of the argument behind deregulation, that myth was consciously and deliberately promoted over the course of the 20th century by business interests, again, largely in America, but not entirely. The book focuses on America because it turned out to be a very big story, but originally we planned to have a chapter on the UK and also Europe, but it turned out to be too much. So we just told the American story, and we're hoping other people will pick up the threads here in Europe.
What we hear in the EU more than free market is competitiveness and the importance of European industry to stay in Europe. What other terms how is it sold to people? Using what narrative, what key terms?
Well, I think what you just said, competitiveness is key, because the idea of competition is linked to the idea of the free market. That the reason the free market works is because you harness competition, and then that drives prosperity, which, is true up to a point. Our argument is not that it's entirely false, but that it's partly false because it neglects, the problem of real harms that can be done by certain kinds of economic activity. We also see the word innovation used a lot, that we want to encourage innovation because innovation is a driver of economic growth, and that regulation stifles innovation. But in fact, not only is that not true, there's very little evidence to suggest that regulation stifles innovation. And if anything, in some cases, regulation encourages innovation, because if you tell the chemical industry, you have to stop making all these toxic chemicals, then they have to be incentivized to come up with alternatives. And in some places in the world, such as California, where there are strict laws about toxic chemicals, we've seen a lot of work done on green chemistry, and we've seen a lot of good innovation producing products that are much less damaging, much less dangerous.
Exactly, it's about steering innovation in the right direction, because otherwise you get regrettable substitution of chemicals that will then again be banned.
Right. In other words, and it's just like one chemical at a time. So bisphenol A is proved to be harmful, so you just substitute bisphenol B, and that's no good way to solve the problem.
Right. So these merchants are they act in bad faith, and they are bad actors. They spread disinformation. You have analyzed 1,000 papers on climate change, and what you found was that there is a consensus in science on the causes and the effects of climate change, and yet these merchants are spreading doubt on that. So how should politics deal with these bad faith actors?
Well, it can be difficult because, as you say, sometimes it's hard to know for sure what's happening, and a big part of our work is to try to show, to prove the evidence of what's happening. So if you have the evidence that people have been operating in bad faith, then it seems to me appropriate to exclude them from the conversation. And we have a good model for this in the United Nations Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So because it was proven that the tobacco industry had lied about their product, had deliberately marketed their products to children and young adults, that they had deliberately manipulated their tobacco product to be more addictive and lied about it, people came to understand that these were bad faith actors. They were not interested in public health. They were certainly not interested in tobacco control, and therefore the Framework Convention explicitly states that the tobacco industry cannot be partners in these negotiations because they cannot be trusted to operate in good faith. I think that we can say the same today about the fossil fuel industry, that they've demonstrated through their own actions that they are not a good faith actor, that they are not committed to addressing the climate crisis, and that they are committed to continuing to sell as much oil and gas as they can for as long as possible, and therefore they're not a trustworthy partner, and they shouldn't be part of the negotiations at COP or elsewhere.
Right. So in Europe, the Forever Lobbying Project, a collaborative project of over 40 journalists from many countries, they demonstrated the same for Plastics Europe and PFAS producers, basically using false arguments on PFAS to decision makers, including using industry-funded science, claiming that the OECD said certain things about a category of PFAS that it didn't say. So would the same apply also to actors in the chemical industry, do you think?
Yeah, I think if you have clear evidence that they've been lying about their product and they've demonstrated through their own actions that they're not trustworthy, then yes, I would say that. And the other thing I think your work speaks to as well is the question of access. So we see this in the United States, that powerful industries have a lot of access to decision makers because those decision makers are, they're concerned maybe about the jobs that these industries generate, or they're also concerned about the threats and the intimidation and the pushback that can happen if they stand up. I mean, we've seen examples where industries have channeled money to support the campaigns to defeat members of Congress who have spoken out on these issues. So I think it's very important that we figure out mechanisms to ensure that, to the extent that these industries have the ear of decision makers, that civil society organizations have an equal opportunity to be heard, because in many cases now they don't.
And in the US, talking about intimidation, you have been at the forefront of exposing disinformation by think tanks, by corporations, including ExxonMobil. Recently, you've had a clash with Bayer about glyphosate. What is their response to you?
Oh, well, their response is to call me names. They try to discredit me because we've got, as we say in America, we have the receipts. So, yeah, their response is to try to discredit me, as it is they try to discredit all of the scientists who do good work demonstrating the harms of their products.
And what is it that you discovered about glyphosate?
Well, the interesting thing here is we didn't really discover anything. There had been lawsuits over potential harms of glyphosate going back many years, and a particular set of lawsuits produced a set of documents that are known as the Monsanto Papers. Journalists have written about this, particularly Stéphane Aurel in Le Monde in France, and also Stéphane Foucault. They've done great work on this. Also, journalists in the United States, Carrie Gillam, wrote a whole book about the Monsanto Papers. And yet, despite all this evidence, so let me just say, so one of the things that came out in the Monsanto Papers was how Monsanto had manipulated the scientific evidence by orchestrating and partially ghostwriting papers claiming that glyphosate was safe, even though there was substantial scientific evidence to at least question that conclusion. This had been known since 2017. It had been written about in the mass media, and yet this particular paper was still in the scientific literature. And so I had the idea that we could ask the question, well, what impact did this paper have? Did the paper actually have the impact that Monsanto presumably wanted it to have in influencing the scientific conversation, influencing regulators, and also partly maybe influencing public opinion? So my research associate and I, Sasha Korov, we thought, well, we could answer that question, and Sasha has very good computational skills. So we basically scoured the internet to answer those questions, and what we were able to show was that the answer was it had a huge impact. It became one of the most cited papers ever published on glyphosate safety. It is cited in several dozen government and regulatory decisions about glyphosate safety. And it was heavily cited in Wikipedia, so therefore influencing public understanding. And in the vast majority of these cases, there's no caveat that says, well, maybe this paper might be questionable. So we published that paper, and I think we were a little lucky with the timing because Bayer was in the midst of trying to negotiate a settlement to a big class action lawsuit in the United States, a class action settlement worth $7 billion. And Bayer had also asked the US Supreme Court to indemnify it from legal liability on the grounds that the EPA had said that this chemical was safe. So because of the timing, we got a lot of attention. for this work, and we submitted a request to the journal to retract the ghostwritten paper, and they did. So to their credit, shout out to the journal, they did the right thing. So this got a lot of media attention, and so then this caused Bayer to be very cross with me, and so now they're attacking my work and saying mean things about me.
And so isn't this the responsibility of the journal in the first place to investigate the
Yes.
allegations of
Yeah.
ghostwriting?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things this shows is that there's a gap in the structures of science because, in theory, yes, it is the responsibility of journals not to publish fraudulent materials, but often journal editors, they don't really have any way of knowing if no one complains. And we asked the journal editor, why had this paper not been retracted previously? And his answer was that before we did, no one had asked. So you have all these campaigners who know about it, you have journalists who know about it, but probably most scientists didn't know because most scientists were probably not reading the journalistic accounts or tracking the lawsuits. Or maybe some scientists did know, but they didn't think it was their place to make the request. So it really fell through the cracks, and it's a little ironic that it took a historian and a computational social scientist to do this work, but we're hoping that it will maybe lead to a larger conversation about what the obligations of editors are, and maybe to set up some kind of better system that if a person has a concern about a paper, they could raise that concern. I mean, there are some places now you can do that. There's this thing called PeerPub where people can post concerns about papers, but I don't know that most journal editors are paying attention. So I think we need a better mechanism to expose these inappropriate practices and to enable journal editors to take action when they've published something that should in fact be retracted.
So what is Bayer and maybe their lobby groups as well, or the consultancies they hire in the US? What are they up to at the moment? What is the process that they are trying that you just described?
The main thing they're trying to do is to get Congress and the states to indemnify them against lawsuits. They want complete legal protection, and they've already introduced bills into a number of states, particularly agricultural states like Iowa, to claim indemnity. And so there are big fights taking place right now. And so we wrote a brief to the Supreme Court in which we argued, if you indemnify this company, you're actually rewarding them for fraud. You're rewarding them for corrupt behavior. Because it is true that the EPA claimed that this chemical was safe, but we're arguing that that claim was based in part on corrupted science. And so you can't say, oh, but it's fine because the EPA said it's fine if the science that they relied on had been corrupted by this company. And we haven't been personally involved in the state debates yet, but I think we're hoping that some of the activists in the states will be able to use our work to say, look, this is a corrupt company that has corrupted the science and is now trying to use the corrupt science to persuade you to protect them, when in reality, they, like any company or any person, should have responsibility for the consequences of the things that they've done.
Yesterday we explained a little bit about the lobbying going on at the EU level by corporations and their allies. And one of the tactics that corporations use is to hire lobby consultancies that open certain doors or that know of certain strategies. One of them is Hill & Knowlton, that you were very familiar with. But in Brussels, like in Washington, there are many others. What is your qualification of a consultancy like Hill & Knowlton?
Well, I'm not an expert on PR and lobbying, but Hill & Knowlton is very famous or infamous in the history of tobacco because they were the PR firm who were the architects of the tobacco industry strategy going back to the 1950s to fight the scientific evidence of climate change. And it was Hill & Knowlton, of the harms of tobacco. It was Hill & Knowlton who met with the heads of a number of different tobacco companies to develop this coordinated industry strategy. And part of the reason why the tobacco industry was prosecuted in the United States for conspiracy was because these different companies who were supposedly competitors, collaborated and conspired to defraud the American people. And Hill Knowlton was the architect of that plan.
And at the same time, as the tobacco disinformation was going on, it was also going on about DDT that had been used in the war and then was proposed as an insecticide.
Yeah, DDT was a little different. I mean, some of the aspects of the story, it's shocking how little it's changed, but other aspects are a little different. So when DDT was banned, there was really widespread support in the United States, bipartisan support to control this chemical that had been shown to be killing birds and fish, including the American eagle, the symbol of the country. So the industry did not successfully mobilize against the banning of DDT. I mean, they tried a little bit. They said that Rachel Carson was a hysterical female. They said that we needed DDT to protect the food supply, many of the same arguments we hear today for glyphosate. But they didn't really mobilize very effectively, so DDT was banned in the United States. It was one of the first actions in the early 1970s when the Environmental Protection Agency was first established. But what they did do was some years later in the 1990s, organized a kind of retrospective attack on Rachel Carson to claim that the banning of DDT was a big mistake, to claim falsely that DDT was necessary to control malaria, and to claim falsely that the scientific basis for banning DDT was incorrect. Those were all completely false claims, and in our work we showed that they were completely false. So you might ask the question, well, why would anyone bother to do that? I mean, DDT, actually people had already stopped using DDT in many parts of the world because insects had evolved resistance. It wasn't even working. But what we argued was that this was an attempt to discredit environmentalism broadly, because the banning of DDT, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, these are often held up as kind of the foundations of modern American environmentalism. You know, the DDT story was a big part of the creation of the EPA. So if you could show that that whole foundation was wrong, that it was an error, then you could cast doubt on environmental regulation broadly. And so what we showed in Merchants of Doubt was that this is what they tried to do. And they tried to broaden the claim to say, look, all these environmentalists are just hysterical, subtext, hysterical females. They're making claims that are not based on science. It's a big error, and we should roll back the regulations. And that's an argument that in different forms we have seen over and over again, including, again, right, even as we speak here in the EU.
And sometimes we see that US business hires consultancies to set up a front group and go out in Brussels and pretend to be European when actually it's largely US multinationals. We have the example of the EPEE, which is the European Partnership for Energy and the Environment. We've recently seen the Competitiveness Roundtable, which is largely ExxonMobil and Chevron and Koch. And they attacked the new law on human rights and business, the CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability and Due Diligence Directive. They attack that very much. Does that resonate? Have you seen that before in your work, that US business mobilizes to influence policies abroad?
Absolutely. And I'd say there's two reasons for that we can identify. I mean, one is that PR agencies and lobbyists are professionals. They're very good at what they do, so they hire experts to figure out what will the strategy be, what arguments will they use. So as you said, competitiveness, innovation. The key is to make what seems like a positive argument for something good that many people will agree with. Many people will say, well, we want to be competitive and we want to be innovative, rather than to defend something bad like a toxic chemical that kills people and costs huge amounts of money to clean up. So it's part of the strategy, you know, it's a meretricious strategy to claim to be arguing for something good when you're actually defending something bad. And then sometimes it involves front organizations to hide the connections. So like you just said, here in Europe, American companies trying to influence European law, but they know the Europeans will resent that, so they create a front organization that appears to be homegrown, but really isn't. And we've seen many, many examples of this. My favorite one is some years ago when I was working on, there was a group called the Informed Citizens for the Environment. So that sounds like a pro-environmental group, right? Well, it was actually an anti-environmental group they ran ad campaigns casting doubt on climate science, claiming that we were going to spend all kinds of money fixing a problem that maybe didn't even exist. And one thing I noticed was the address of this group was in a particular street in Arlington, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., and I recognized the name because it was the same street where the National Science Foundation has its headquarters, and I'd been there many times. And then I noticed that address was the exact same address, the same number, not just the same street, but the same number of the Western Fuels Association. Western Fuels Association was a conglomerate of coal producers from the Powder River Basin in Wyoming. So this organization was 100% front, same building, same people, and it turned out wholly owned, wholly organized, and wholly funded by coal producers, but pretending to be an environmental group.
We even have the Consumer Choice Center in Brussels, which is also funded by Koch. It's a US group, sort of pretending to be an NGO for consumers. And stepping in when the real Consumers Association, BIUC, doesn't have the positions that the industry likes. So then, they get involved on glyphosate, for instance, and say how citizens benefit from glyphosate. Yesterday you met with a large group of progressive businesses, business leaders who want to do things differently. What have you told them to do, and how do you think their message could be better heard?
Yeah, well, it's a complicated question, and obviously I don't live in Europe, so I'm not, as close to some of the issues here as you are. But I think one of the most important things, both in Europe and the United States, is for more businesses to be heard. Because we know that big corporations that are producing damaging products like pesticides and fossil fuels are very active defending their products. They lobby extensively. They have very large budgets for these public relations and lobbying campaigns. And civil society groups are generally outspent by at least 10 to 1, if not more. But, and also, as you said, the arguments that they make are often arguments about the economy, competitiveness, jobs. But there's a huge universe of business people who run good businesses that don't destroy the environment, don't damage our health, and yet I think political leaders don't hear from them enough. And yet these, many thousands or hundreds of thousands of small and medium-sized businesses are crucial to the economy. They generate a lot of jobs. Many of them are more innovative than the giant companies. So I think that if the business community created more alliances to speak up in favor of the regulations that can empower the genuinely innovative companies, and also to point out that regulations can be good for the economy if they create a level playing field. Because if you roll back environmental protection, it hurts the companies that have been trying to do the right thing, and it actually benefits the companies who are doing the wrong things. It benefits the bad actors, and that's not in society's interest. So having fair regulations, well thought through regulations that are applied equitably across industry is actually in the interest not just of the citizens of the European Union, but it's in the interest of most businesses as well. And so I think we need to hear much more from those businesses who could really credibly make the case for why appropriate regulations are actually a good thing. And that's part of my argument, is that the right wing and the business leaders have so demonized the whole concept of regulation. And we need to say, no, regulation is good. Regulation protects us. Regulation favors the good companies that do the right things. Regulation is like having rules of the road. You wouldn't get on the Autobahn with no rules of the road because you'd crash and be killed, right? So we understand that you need rules of the road for the highway system to work effectively and safely. Well, that's true of the economy as well. We want the economy to work, but we want it to work effectively, and we want it to work safely. And we don't want it to work at the expense of people, whose homes will be destroyed by climate change or whose health will be destroyed by dangerous toxic chemicals.
You will be speaking also at several universities. So the same question, what about the scientists or the academics? What is their role?
Yeah, well, that's a tricky one too. You know, I'm always a little reluctant to criticize scientists because I feel like most scientists are working really hard to get the right answers, and then to ask them to also do a lot more in the public sphere, you know, it's asking a lot. But I do think that scientists can do somewhat more, and that if every scientist just spent a little bit of time, you know, maybe one day a month, thinking about how they can communicate more broadly about their findings, I think that could be very powerful, because right now a lot of people are getting their information on scientific questions from people who have a vested interest in misrepresenting the data. But if scientists can say, well, hey, I did that work. I'm the guy or the gal who actually did the work on rats that showed that, you know, glyphosate causes tumors in mice, or whatever the example is. You know, there's a certain credibility that comes from hearing from the person who did the work and seeing that the person is just a regular person like you or me, and they don't have a vested interest and they don't have stock in, you know, this chemical. I think that could be quite powerful. And, you know, one thing that public opinions show in America, most Americans know no scientists. Most Americans can't even name a single living scientist. So science is a very abstract concept for most people, but studies also show that if you meet a scientist, if you talk to a scientist, if that scientist makes an effort to explain their work and to explain the scientific process, that can have a salutary effect, and it can empower people to understand what's really going on. I wrote my book, Why Trust Science, partly for that reason, to sort of help people think through, well, what is science really anyway? And what are we saying when we say, well, the science shows X? And it doesn't mean that the science is perfect, but it means that you have good reason to think that these claims are probably right. And we also have good reasons to think that the claims of the manufacturers of these pesticides or PFAS chemicals, well, they have a vested interest in denying the evidence that these things are harmful, where scientists, for the most part, with some exceptions, have a vested interest in telling the truth.
Thank you very much for this interview in the middle of a heat wave right now here in Brussels. And I wish you a great tour in Europe.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for your work. It's really great what you're doing.